The communist takeover of Eastern Europe and the American reaction through the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. As World War II ended, the Soviet Red Army had gradually occupied, or liberated as they would have seen it, the countries of Eastern Europe. As you know from Yalta and Potsdam, the Allied powers had agreed that in these countries there would be free elections. Particularly contentious was Poland, where Stalin was determined to set up a government friendly to him. And Winston Churchill was determined to return the Poles from London that he had supported during World War II to government in their rightful places, he would have seen it, as the government in Warsaw. Now, as the Red Armies gradually occupied Eastern Europe, Stalin adopted a number of tactics to make sure that these countries remained loyal to him. This is often called salami tactics, as the Soviets used a range of policies to try and eliminate their opposition. This ranged from making sure they controlled the secret police forces in order to be able to arrest opponents and destroy opposition, and also always forming coalition governments or popular fronts with similar parties to the communists, like the socialists, and then gradually eroding the popularity of these parties. This was successful by 1945 in meaning that the Soviets had control of Bulgaria, Hungary and Romania by 1947, Poland effectively by 1945, and though it wasn't until 1947 that the communists had absolute control. And Stalin also had a significant influence in Albania, although in Albania the communists had faced no opposition in taking control. Stalin also had a significant ally in Yugoslavia, which effectively had its own communist revolution, where the communists led by Marshal Tito had taken control of Yugoslavia for themselves. The exceptions here in this communist takeover were East Germany, where effectively this was given to the Soviets in 1945 to administer under the terms of the Yalta and Potsdam agreements, and Czechoslovakia, which remained a coalition government until 1948, and we'll come to the particulars of that country's transformation to communism in a moment. Now, this gradual spread of communism led to a good deal of unrest in the West, who didn't understand Stalin's overriding desire was to protect himself, given his fear of American nuclear weapons, American imperialism, British imperialism, and also, most significantly, the devastating impact of the German invasion through Poland and through East Germany and Czechoslovakia that so badly made the Soviet Union suffer. So Stalin desperately wanted to protect himself. In the West, they didn't quite see it like this, and it's in this context that in March 1946, Winston Churchill in Fulton, Missouri, gives the very famous Iron Curtain speech. Now, the Iron Curtain speech is not about curtains, as this lovely example from IKEA here demonstrates. The Iron Curtain speech is essentially about the division of Europe, and Churchill warns of this division and effectively is describing here Stalin's occupation of Eastern Europe. Now, Churchill is trying to do two things here. He's warning of the threat of communism. He's a long-term opponent of that. He's also trying to draw the attention of President Harry Truman to the situation in Europe in the hope that Truman doesn't withdraw all aid to European countries. Britain at this time is suffering really badly as a result of their wartime exertions. And Churchill is effectively saying that Britain can no longer stick to its security agreements in Greece and Turkey, and also warning of the serious threat of communism that was endangering even countries like France and Italy, where very strong communist parties were coming to power. And this curtain that Churchill warns of dividing Europe, this metaphoric curtain, is something which then makes Truman think again about his policy. Truman, not long before, had stopped all aid to Europe and to the Soviet Union, and had to rethink that quite drastically in 1947. What Truman does at this point in the United States, he gives a very famous speech where he says that he will effectively do anything to stop the spread of communism, and this becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, his kind of promise that he is going to prevent any communist aggression. Now, particularly this applies in the bottom corner of this map here in Greece and Turkey, where there is ongoing civil wars between communists and capitalist forces. And Truman initially gives $400 million of military aid to Greece and Turkey to stop this communist threat. For Stalin, this is perceived as an aggressive act and is one of the next kind of flashpoints in the Cold War. Further to this, Truman also sends General George Marshall to Europe to survey the situation and see if Churchill's assessment of the situation is correct. George Marshall, encouraged by the British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, realises that Europe is in a really bad way, and that this kind of poverty and deprivation is a real kind of grounds for communism to take over even into Western Europe. And so he encourages Truman and eventually the American Congress that what they need to do is give significant financial aid to the European states. Now this doesn't look like the American Congress are going to approve this until Stalin's Communist Party and the KGB in Czechoslovakia, and we're going to use this street scene for Czechoslovakia in this instance, start using some very aggressive tactics. And it looks in Czechoslovakia, there's a standoff in Czechoslovakia between communists and their socialist allies for some period of time. In 1948, the KGB and the Czechoslovakian communists launch a radical and kind of violent coup, which culminates in poor old Jan Masaryk here being murdered effectively by the KGB by being thrown out of his fourth-storey window of his apartment where he's being buried. You can see him with the slightly wonky glasses here. This is probably in a bit bad taste. So Jan Masaryk is murdered, and Czechoslovakia at that point in 1948 becomes another communist state. Now this is enough to tip the balance of power in America and to get Congress to sign over approximately $17 billion in aid to Europe under what becomes known as the Marshall Plan. The majority of this money actually goes to Britain, or a large proportion of it goes to Britain. France and Italy receive significant amounts, and West Germany. And it even goes slightly unusually to some communist countries. So Yugoslavia accept Marshall aid, and it's offered to some East European countries. Now this leads to Stalin's fury. He's furious at this, and essentially because Joseph Stalin sees this as an aggressive act, as America's attempt to buy itself an empire. And him and his foreign minister Molotov call this dollar imperialism. This leads to some reactions from the communists, most notably setting up Cominform and Comecon to try to spread communism and also to make sure that communist countries have economic aid. And it also leads to Yugoslavia being kicked out of the Communist Alliance because he accepted the Marshall Aid in 1948. This is also one of the reasons why Stalin ends up blockading Berlin in 1948. And now see if you can have a go at these questions here.